She was laughing when she said it. That's the part I keep coming back to. It was a Thursday morning in October, and the air coming off the bay still had that sharp salt and diesel smell I've never been able to separate from the idea of work. I was under a '68 Ford F-100 that belonged to a retired electrician named Gus, replacing a brake line that had corroded straight through, when I heard heels on the concrete floor of my shop. Not the careful kind of heels, the kind a person wears when they know the floor might be slick. These were the confident kind, the kind that assume the floor will accommodate them. I slid out from under the truck. She was standing in the bay entrances with the morning light behind her, wearing a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, carrying a tote bag that probably cost more than my monthly insurance premium. Late 40s, maybe 50, the kind of woman who looked like she had never once waited in a line that she hadn't arranged to skip. Behind her, through the open roll-up door, I could see a flatbed truck idling at the curb. On the flatbed was a 1966 Jaguar E-Type Series 1 Roadster, British racing green, right-hand drive, with a long scratch down the passenger door that looked like someone had dragged a key the full length of it. I wiped my hands on a shop rag and stood up. She looked at me the way people look at a vending machine. Not unkindly, exactly, but without any particular acknowledgement that there was a person behind the glass. "I need someone to restore this," she said. "Properly. Not a body shop. Someone who actually understands what it is." I looked at the car on the flatbed. I'd been working on British classics for almost 15 years. My old man had a workshop out back of our house in Medford, and he'd spent every weekend of my childhood with his hands inside something English and temperamental. When he died, he left me his tools, his library of workshop manuals, and a 1972 Triumph TR6 that still needed a new gearbox. I never did finish that gearbox, but I learned everything he knew, and then some. "What year did she come off the line?" I asked. The woman blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The E-Type. What year?" "1966, she said, with a slight edge that told me she'd expected a different kind of first question. "Right-hand drive, so she's a UK spec car. You imported her yourself?" "My father did. In 1971. She paused. "He passed away recently. I'd like to restore the car to the condition it was in when he bought it." I looked at the car again. The bodywork was rough, more than just the scratch. There was a repair on the front valance that had been done cheap, probably in the '80s, and the chrome on the bumpers had the mottled look of pieces that had been replated incorrectly. But underneath all of that, the bones were good. The lines were still right. The car hadn't been cut or welded in any structural way that I could see from 20 feet. "You want a quote today? I want to know if you can actually do this," she said. "I've already spoken to 3 restoration shops. 2 of them quoted me timelines they couldn't possibly meet. One of them didn't know what a Series 1 was." I almost smiled at that. "Leave her with me for a couple of days. Let me do a full inspection before I give you a number." She studied me for a moment, and I don't know exactly what she was looking for, but whatever it was, she seemed to find enough of it. "Fine," she said. She reached into the tote bag and produced a business card. I took it without looking at it, then she said it. The thing she was laughing about when she said it. She was already half turned back toward the door when she glanced at the car, then back at me, and smiled the way a person smiles at their own private joke. "Restore her perfectly," she said, "and maybe I'll marry you." Then she walked out, her heels sharp on the concrete, back into the morning light. I stood there with her card in my hand. I looked down at it. Laurel Ashworth, CEO Ashworth Capital Partners. I set the card on my workbench next to a coffee mug that said World's Oakiest Mechanic, a gift from my daughter Bria, who was 6 years old and found this extremely funny. Then I went back under Gus's truck. Bria was waiting for me at the after-school program when I pulled up at 5:15 in my work truck, which had a cracked windshield I kept meaning to replace, and a toolbox in the bed that rattled every time I went over a bump. She was sitting on the front steps with her backpack between her knees, and when she saw me, she picked it up and ran. She was small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and a gap between her front teeth that her dentist assured me she would grow into. She climbed into the passenger seat and dropped her backpack on the floor, and immediately started telling me about a girl in her class named Zoe, who had brought a salamander to school inside her lunchbox, and the salamander had gotten loose, and things had escalated from there. I listened to the whole story twice, because the second telling had better details. We stopped at the grocery store on the way home. Bria pushed the cart with great seriousness, consulting the list I'd written on the back of a receipt, reading the words she knew and asking about the ones she didn't. She put a box of cereal in the cart that was not on the list, and I put it back and she put it in again, and I let it stay. My name is James Calloway. I am 41 years old. I own a small restoration and repair shop in a neighborhood of South Boston that hasn't finished deciding what it wants to be. Half the storefronts are art studios and overpriced coffee places, and half of them are still the same hardware stores and dry cleaners they've been for 40 years. I fall somewhere in the middle. My shop is called Calloway Restorations, which is not a particularly creative name, but it is accurate. Bria's mother and I were married for 3 years and separated for 1 before she decided that Boston was not where her life was going to happen. She moved to Portland, Oregon, not Maine, when Bria was 14 months old. We have a custody arrangement that is technically joint but practically lopsided, because Portland is 3,000 miles away and plane tickets cost money. Bria spends summers and Christmases with her mother. The rest of the year she's with me. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because it is the context for everything that followed. I pulled the Jaguar off the flatbed the next morning and put her up on the lift. What I found in the first 2 hours was mostly what I expected. The engine, a 4.2-liter inline-6, numbers matching, which is something, hadn't been properly serviced in years. The coolant hoses were original rubber, cracked at the fittings. The carburetors were gummed and out of balance. The wiring loom had been partially replaced at some point with incorrect gauge wire, and whoever had done it had used modern automotive crimp connectors instead of the correct spade terminals, which on an older British car is the kind of shortcut that can haunt you. The bodywork was worse close up than it had been from a distance. The repair on the front valance I'd noticed from the driveway turned out to be more extensive than it looked. Someone had used filler over filler, layered it, which meant the metal underneath hadn't been properly addressed. You could tap it and hear the difference. I photographed everything. I took 63 photographs in the first morning. What I did not expect was what I found in the afternoon. I was under the car, checking the frame rails for rust, when I noticed something about the left rear suspension upright. It's a subtle thing, and I want to be honest about how I found it. It wasn't brilliance. It was familiarity. I had replaced that exact component on 2 other E-Types in the last decade, and I knew what it was supposed to look like, and what I was looking at did not look like that. The upright was not original. That in itself isn't unusual. These parts wear out, and finding correct original components for a 60-year-old racing heritage car isn't always practical. But this replacement wasn't a period-correct part, and it wasn't a quality aftermarket piece. It was a fabricated unit. Someone had machined it, or had it machined, to look approximately correct at a glance. But the geometry was wrong, subtly wrong in a way that would not show up until the car was on the road, at speed, in a corner. A car with this problem would handle badly. It would feel vague, unsettled, and at the wrong moment, the wrong corner, the wrong speed, it could become genuinely dangerous. I lay under the car for a long time. The fabricated part had been painted to match the undercarriage, which suggested it had been done during a restoration. At some point, someone had either made a mistake they didn't admit to, or they had deliberately installed a substandard component in a customer's car and hoped no one would ever notice. I thought about what Laurel Ashworth had told me, that her father had bought this car in 1971, that he had recently passed away, that she wanted to restore it to the condition it was in when he bought it. Her father had owned this car for over 50 years. He might have driven it with this problem for years, or it might have developed more recently. I had no way of knowing without more information. What I did know was that I was looking at something that could have hurt someone, that might still hurt someone, if the car went back on the road without being fixed. And I knew that if I fixed it quietly, swapped in the correct part, and said nothing, no one would ever be the wiser. The car would drive properly. The client would be happy. I would be paid. I knew all of that. I slid out from under the car and called her. She arrived at the shop the following morning with a man in his mid-30s, who she introduced as her assistant, Brennan. And I immediately had to stop myself, because there was a Brennan already on the name list I keep in my head, which is something I do without meaning to. But the man beside her was not a character in a story. He was a real person with a leather portfolio and a way of standing that suggested he was there to take notes and prevent misunderstandings. I showed her what I had found. I took her under the car on the lift. She did not hesitate. She crouched right down and looked where I pointed, and I explained what the suspension upright was supposed to look like and what this one looked like and why the difference mattered. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she stood up and brushed the knees of her slacks and said, "When was this done?" "I can't say with certainty," I said, "but based on the paint and the corrosion pattern on the fasteners, I'd estimate somewhere between 10 and 20 years ago." "My father had a restoration done," she said slowly, "around 2009, at a shop in Connecticut." She said the name of the shop. I didn't know it, but the automotive restoration world in New England is not enormous, and I had a feeling I could find out about them if I needed to. "Did your father drive the car after that restoration?" "Some," she said. "He said it never drove quite right after that work. He thought it was just his age, that he'd lost the feel for it." She stopped. "He stopped driving it about 4 years later." I looked at her. She was looking at the car. "He thought it was him," she said very quietly. "I want to be careful here about how I describe what followed, because I don't want to make it more dramatic than it was. There was no explosion. She did not cry, not in front of me. She asked several precise, intelligent questions about the component, about what correct replacement would involve, about whether the problem was something that could be documented. I answered all of them. Then she asked me to step outside with her, away from her assistant, and we stood on the sidewalk in front of my shop in the thin October sun, and she said, "How much would you estimate a restoration like this would cost? Complete, done properly." I had run the numbers that morning, somewhere between $80,000 and $110,000, I said, depending on what else I find and what parts I can source correctly. That's a real number, not a soft quote. She nodded slowly. "And the suspension component?" "Correct part is available. It's not cheap, but it's not the hard part. The hard part is the documentation. If you want to pursue anything regarding the shop that did the previous restoration." She looked at me for a moment. The wind off the harbor moved a strand of hair across her face and she pushed it back. "I'll send you a signed authorization to proceed," she said. "Full restoration. Take whatever time you need to do it right." She started to turn toward the car that was waiting for her at the curb. "Ms. Ashworth," I said. She stopped. "I'm going to need a point of contact for questions as they come up. There will be decisions along the way where I'll need guidance on your preferences." "You'll have my direct line," she said. "Use it." She got in the car. I watched it pull away. I went back inside and stood in front of the Jaguar for a while, my hands in my pockets, thinking about a man who stopped driving a car he loved because he thought his hands had forgotten how. She called for the first time 3 days later, not about a decision, just to ask how it was going. I told her I'd sourced the correct suspension upright from a specialist in the UK, that the engine was fully stripped and the block looked good, that I'd found a set of correct SU carburetors in better shape than the originals. She asked questions that were more informed than I expected. She knew what an SU carburetor was, which told me she'd done some reading. She called again the following week to ask about a specific detail on the dashboard. Her father had replaced the original steering wheel at some point with an aftermarket piece. Did I know what the original would have looked like? I did. I had a photograph of the original wheel in my reference library and I sent it to her. She texted back 12 minutes later. "That's exactly what I remember." The calls became a regular thing. Not every day, but often enough that I started expecting them, the way you expect certain things that have become part of the shape of your week. She asked once about Bria. I had mentioned her name in passing, something about picking her up from school. Laurel said, "How old is she?" And I said 6, and Laurel said that's a good age, in a way that didn't sound like small talk. One afternoon in November, I had the car down off the lift, and the engine back in but not started yet. And I was doing the final wiring check with the radio going, and Bria was sitting on an overturned milk crate in the corner of the shop doing her homework. She did this sometimes on the days when school let out before I could pick her up, and my neighbor Teresa would drop her at the shop, and she'd set up on her milk crate, with her worksheet and her backpack and her juice box, and act like this was perfectly normal, which for her it was. Laurel arrived for what she called a progress check without calling ahead. She walked into the shop and stopped when she saw Bria. Bria looked up from her worksheet. "Hi," she said. "Are you the lady whose car that is?" Laurel looked at her for a moment. "I am," she said. "My dad says it's one of the most beautiful cars ever made," Bria said. "He says it looks like it's going fast even when it's standing still." Laurel looked at me. I shrugged. "Your dad is right," Laurel said. Bria considered this. "Do you want to see what I'm working on?" She held up her worksheet. Laurel walked over and crouched down, which she did without a second thought, and looked at the worksheet. It was a second-grade reading comprehension exercise about a dog who found a lost sock. Laurel read it with what appeared to be genuine interest. "What do you think the dog should do?" Bria asked. "I think he should return the sock," Laurel said, "even if it was inconvenient." Bria nodded seriously. "That's what I think too." I went back to the wiring. It was in December that I found the documentation. I had been researching the Connecticut shop that had done the 2009 restoration. Not because it was my job, but because I couldn't not. I have a way of pulling at loose threads that my ex-wife once called a compulsion, and that I prefer to call thoroughness. I contacted 2 other restorers I knew who had worked in that region during that period. I checked the Jaguar enthusiast forums, where old restorations get discussed in considerable detail. I made several phone calls. What I found was a pattern. The Connecticut shop, which had closed in 2014, had done at least 4 other restorations during that era where subsequent owners had discovered quality problems. Not the same problem as Laurel's car, but problems of the same category. Corners cut in ways that required expertise to identify, documented after the fact by specialist restorers. One of those restorations had resulted in an insurance claim when a car had been damaged in a handling incident. The claim had been paid. The cause had never been formally attributed to the restoration work. I sat with this information for 3 days. I was under no obligation to share any of it. My job was to restore the car. I had found the mechanical problem. I had disclosed it. I was fixing it. What I had found about the shop was circumstantial, historical, and legally complicated in ways I was not equipped to evaluate. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon. Bria was at school. The shop was quiet, just the space heater going and the sound of the street outside. I told her everything I had found. She was silent for long enough that I said her name to check if the call had dropped. "I'm here," she said. "I want to be clear," I said, "that I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not telling you what to do with this. I'm telling you because I thought you should know. What you do with it is your business, James," she said, which was the first time she had used my name. "How long did this take you?" "A few weeks." "On and off. That wasn't part of what I'm paying you for." "No," I said. Another silence. "Why?" she said. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Gus and his brake line, and the way some problems are someone else's fault but still end up being your responsibility. I thought about a man who stopped driving a car he loved because he thought it was him. "Because your father deserved to know it wasn't his hands," I said. "And you deserve to know what happened to his car." She didn't say anything after that for a while. Then she said, "I'll call my attorney." The car was finished in February. I started the engine on a Wednesday morning with no one else in the shop, because the first start after a full restoration is something I prefer to experience alone. There is always a moment before the engine catches when the accumulated months of work hang in the air like a held breath, and then the engine turns over, and either it sounds right or it doesn't. This one sounded right. It sounded more than right. The 4.2 on E-Types from this era has a particular voice, a deep, layered sound that isn't loud exactly but fills whatever space it's in. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine idling and the heater not yet warm and just listened. I called her and said it was ready. She came on a Saturday morning. She arrived before I expected her, alone this time. No assistant, no driver waiting at the curb. She was wearing a dark coat and leather gloves, and she stood in the entrance of the shop for a moment before she walked in. The car was in the center of the floor, freshly detailed, the green paintwork deep and clean. I had re-chromed the bumpers and the trim pieces. I had replaced the leather in the cockpit with material that matched the original specification. I had installed the correct steering wheel. She stood in front of the car and didn't say anything. Then she took off her right glove and ran 2 fingers along the front edge of the hood, just lightly, the way you touch something you're not sure is real. He would have liked this, she said. I didn't say anything. She looked at the invoice I'd left on the hood. She looked at the number. This is less than your estimate, she said. I found the carburetors cheaper than I expected, I said. And the body repairs took fewer materials than I budgeted. I'm not going to charge you for hours I didn't work. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Most people would have kept the margin, she said. I'm not most people, I said. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. I'm beginning to understand that. She put her glove back on and picked up the invoice. About what I said, she said. The morning I brought the car in. The marriage proposal, I said. I was joking. I know, I say things like that. She paused. My assistant tells me it makes people uncomfortable. It didn't make me uncomfortable, I said. It made me curious. She looked at me then, a real look, the kind that takes a moment and gives something back. Curious about what? She said. About whether you ever meant anything you said as a joke, I said. The shop was quiet except for the space heater and the distant sound of the street. The Jaguar sat between us in the February light that came through the high windows, green and perfect and patient, the way beautiful things are patient. Laurel Ashworth held my gaze for a count of 3. Then she said, I suppose that depends on the question. I didn't sleep particularly well that night, but it was the good kind of not sleeping, the kind that comes from thinking about something rather than worrying about it. I lay in the dark and listened to the heat come on and then go off in the apartment, and at some point I heard Bria call out in her sleep, one of those wordless sounds kids make that don't mean anything, just the noise of dreaming. I got up and checked on her the way I always do. She was fine. She was on her side with her arm around the stuffed elephant that goes everywhere she goes, her face slack and open the way kids' faces are when they sleep, completely trusting. The nightlight on her dresser made everything orange and soft. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I thought about all the things that had led to this particular Thursday in October. The timing of it, the car coming in when it did, the problem I found and the choice I made, and the phone call I made after it. I thought about my old man in his workshop in Medford, and the TR6 that still needed a gearbox, and what he used to say when I asked him how he always knew what the right thing to do was. He said, "You don't always know, you just do it and find out." I went back to bed. In the morning, Bria wanted scrambled eggs with too much cheese, which is how she always wants them, and I made them, and we sat at the kitchen table, and she told me about a dream she'd had about a library where all the books were about dogs. Outside the window, the February sky was the flat pale color it gets before snow, and somewhere across the city a woman was probably having her Saturday coffee and looking at an invoice for a restored Jaguar that would never be driven carelessly again. I poured another cup of coffee. I thought about questions that depend on the asking.